He stood at a gas station on Route 9 at 6 in the morning, with $43 in his checking account and a jar of hot sauce in the passenger seat that his mother had made every August for as long as he could remember. 18 months later, he was standing in a conference room at Target's headquarters in Minneapolis, and the man across the table was asking how fast he could get them 10,000 units. But that meeting was still 18 months away, and before it happened, there was the matter of the jar. Franklin Okafor had been a line supervisor at a packaging plant in Decatur, Georgia, for 11 years. He was good at the job. He showed up early, stayed late, knew every machine on the floor by sound. He could tell when a conveyor belt was about to slip by, the way it hummed 2 pitches lower than usual. He had trained 4 people who were now his equals and 2 who had been promoted above him, and he had done this without bitterness because he believed, for a long time, that his turn was coming. His turn did not come. What came instead was a Tuesday afternoon in March when his supervisor called him into the office and told him the plant was restructuring and his position had been eliminated. The supervisor looked at the wall when he said it. Franklin looked at the supervisor. He shook the man's hand because that was what he had been raised to do, and because there was nothing else available in that moment, and he walked out of the building for the last time carrying a cardboard box with a coffee mug, a phone charger, and a framed photograph of his daughter taken at her 3rd grade science fair. He drove home on I-80F in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon with the photograph on the passenger seat facing up. His daughter, Nadia, was grinning in the photo, holding a poster board about the life cycle of a butterfly. She was 8 in that picture. She was 11 now. His wife, Sandra, had left 4 years earlier. Not dramatically. There had been no single argument, no ultimatum, no door slamming. There had been a slow accumulation of silences that eventually became the only thing between them, and one day she had packed 2 suitcases and moved to her sister's house in Marietta, and 3 months after that the divorce was finalized and Nadia lived with Franklin during the week, and with Sandra on weekends, and this arrangement had become the shape of their lives the way most arrangements do, not by choice exactly, but by the gradual hardening of the temporary into the permanent. Franklin pulled into the driveway. He sat in the car for a while. The photograph looked up at him. He went inside and stood in the kitchen. On the counter, near the back where he kept things he used often, was the jar. It was a plain mason jar with a white lid and a piece of masking tape on the side where he had written in marker, "Mama Bia's." Inside was a dark red sauce that smelled like charred peppers and garlic, and something deeper underneath. Something he could not name, but that he had been tasting his entire life. His mother, Beatrice Okafor, had made this sauce every August in the house in Macon where he grew up. She made it in a large pot on the stove with peppers from her garden, dried ones she had been collecting and storing since the previous fall, garlic that she roasted whole until it softened and sweetened, onions, a splash of apple cider vinegar, and spices she measured with her hands. Not with spoons because she had been making it long enough that her hands knew the amounts the way a musician's hands know the chords without looking at them. She had been making it since before Franklin was born. Her own mother had made it before her. It was the kind of sauce that people asked about at cookouts and church dinners and family gatherings, and the answer was always some version of a smile and the words, "It is just something I put together," which was not accurate, but was the only answer she gave, because some things are not meant to be explained, only experienced. Beatrice had died the previous October. She was 73. She had been healthy by most measures, gardening until September, attending church every Sunday, cooking Sunday dinner the week before she passed. Her heart had simply stopped in her sleep, quietly and without announcement, the way hearts do when they have decided they are finished. She left behind very little of monetary value. She left behind the house, which was small and paid off, and went to Franklin's younger sister. She left behind her Bible, her jewelry box, a lifetime of small kindnesses that people still mentioned when they saw Franklin in Macon. And she left behind the recipe, which lived not in a written document, but in Franklin's hands, because she had taught him in that kitchen on Saturday mornings, starting when he was 9 years old. Standing on a step stool beside the stove while she narrated each step the way she narrated everything, plainly and completely, without flourish. He had been making the sauce himself for the 2 years since she got too tired to stand at the stove for long stretches. He made it in August, the way she had, with peppers from a garden plot he had started in the backyard for this specific purpose. He gave jars to neighbors and co-workers and brought them to family gatherings, and people always said the same thing: "This is the one. Where do you get this? You need to sell this." He had never taken that seriously. He was a plant supervisor. He made things on machines. Sauces were something you made at home and gave away. They were not something you sold. He stood in the kitchen on the afternoon he lost his job and looked at the jar. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The label was masking tape and a black marker. The sauce inside was the color of something that had been made slowly, over time, with attention. He set it back on the counter. He did not make any decisions that afternoon. He made coffee and helped Nadia with her homework and cooked dinner and went to bed. But he did not stop thinking about the jar. His neighbor, a woman named June Castillo, had lived next door for 7 years. She was in her 60s, recently retired from the county health department, and she had the particular quality of attention that comes from spending 3 decades listening carefully to people who were trying to explain their problems. She noticed things. She did not say everything she noticed. She waited until it was useful. The week after Franklin lost his job, she came to the door with a casserole and a bluntness that he had always appreciated in her. She said, "You have been standing in your driveway looking at nothing twice this week. Come sit on the porch." He sat. He told her about the plant. She listened the way she always listened, without rushing to fill the pauses. After a while she said, "What are you good at?" He said he knew how to run a production floor, manage people, fix machines. She said, "What else?" He looked at her. He said, "I make my mother's hot sauce." She said, "I know, you gave me a jar last August. I put it on everything for 2 months and then I was rationing it." He said, "People say I should sell it." She said, "People say a lot of things. What do you think?" He did not answer right away. Then he said, "I think it is genuinely better than anything I have ever bought in a store. I think I have believed that for years. I just never thought it was mine to sell." June said, "Whose is it then?" He did not have an answer for that either. But the question stayed with him after he went back inside, the way certain questions do. Not because you cannot answer them, but because the answer is closer than you expected. And that is the part that takes getting used to. Georgia's cottage food law allowed the production and direct sale of certain low-risk foods made in a home kitchen without a commercial license or health department inspection. Hot sauce qualified. The annual revenue cap was $50,000 for direct sales. You could sell at farmers markets, roadside stands, directly to individuals. You could not sell online. You could not sell through retail stores. You needed a label that identified the product, listed all ingredients, stated the net weight, and included the line, "Made in a home kitchen not inspected by the Georgia Department of Agriculture." Franklin found this information on a state government website at 2 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table while Nadia slept upstairs. He wrote the key points on the back of an envelope and then wrote numbers next to them. Peppers, garlic, onions, vinegar, spices. He knew what his batches cost because he had been buying the same ingredients in similar quantities for 2 years. He knew the yield per batch. He knew how many jars a single batch filled. He worked out the math on the same envelope. His cost per 8-ounce jar, including the jar itself and the lid, was approximately $1.90. At farmers markets, comparable artisan hot sauces sold for $8 to $12 per jar. At $9, his margin per jar was over $7. It was not a full income, it was a start. He put the envelope in the kitchen drawer where he kept things he was not ready to throw away and not ready to act on. It stayed there for 6 days. Then he called the DeKalb Farmers Market and asked about vendor applications. The first Saturday was in April. He arrived at the market at 6:30 with 2 cardboard boxes in the trunk of his car, 48 jars of Mama Bea's hot sauce in 3 heat levels, mild, original, and fire, labels he had printed at the library on adhesive paper, and a folding table he had borrowed from June. He had no sign. He had no tablecloth. He had a cardboard piece cut from a shipping box that said Mama Bea's hot sauce in black marker. He set the jars in rows by heat level and stood behind the table and waited. For the first 2 hours, no one stopped. People walked past the way people walk through a museum without looking at the art, their eyes moving ahead to whatever they had already decided they were there for. He smiled at anyone who glanced at the table. Most kept walking. By 9 o'clock, he had sold 2 jars. He was doing the math in his head. 2 jars, $18, minus the table fee, minus ingredients, minus jar costs. This was not a business. This was a Saturday. A man stopped at 10 after 9. He was heavy-set, wearing a Braves cap and carrying a reusable bag with vegetables in it. He picked up a jar of the original and turned it over and read the label without saying anything. He said, "What is in here besides peppers?" Franklin told him. Roasted garlic, apple cider vinegar, a dry spice blend his mother had developed over 30 years, no preservatives, no added sugar, nothing he could not pronounce. The man opened the jar. Franklin had set out a small dish of crackers and a plastic spreader for samples. The man put a thin line of sauce on a cracker and ate it. He chewed slowly. He picked up another cracker. He said, "What is that underneath the heat? That nutty thing?" Franklin said, "The garlic is roasted until it caramelizes. There is a smokiness in the dry peppers that my mother got from drying them herself over a long season. 2 years of sun on the same plant, if you grow it right." The man looked at him. He said, "Your mother make this?" Franklin said, "She taught me. She is not here anymore." The man nodded once. He picked up 2 jars of original and 1 of fire and put $18 on the table and walked away without saying anything else. By noon, Franklin had sold 19 jars, not a windfall, but enough that the math looked different than it had at 9 o'clock. He packed up what remained, loaded the table back into the car, and drove home. Nadia was at Sanger's for the weekend. The house was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table and counted the money. He pressed each bill flat before stacking it, a habit he had developed somewhere and never examined. He wrote the total in a small spiral notebook, the kind students use, that he had bought at the dollar store for this purpose. He sat with the number for a while. Then he opened the spiral notebook to the next blank page and started writing down what he would do differently the following Saturday. The second week was better. He made a sign on a piece of poster board with clear writing and the words "small batch, handmade, Machin family recipe." He brought samples in small cups instead of crackers in a spreader. He made 60 jars instead of 48, because the previous week's math had suggested he could have sold more than he did. He sold 31 jars. The third week he sold 44. People came back. A woman in a linen shirt who had bought 2 jars the first week came back with her husband and bought 6. A man from a nearby church said he had told his whole congregation about it and came back the next 2 Saturdays with different people each time. Word of mouth is not something you can make happen. You can only make something worth talking about and then get out of the way. By the end of the second month, he had a Saturday morning line, not a long one. 5 or 6 people standing before the market opened, waiting. He had started taking pre-orders on a paper form he kept clipped to a clipboard at the table. The money was not yet a living. His severance from the plant had covered rent through June. He had applied for jobs, quietly, in the evenings after Nadia was asleep. He went to 3 interviews and received 2 rejections and was waiting to hear from the third. He kept the notebook current every Saturday. He did not let himself believe the sauce was a business yet. He let himself believe it was a direction. There was also the question of the heat, not in the sauce, in the process. In June, on the first genuinely hot Saturday of summer, he made a batch and something went wrong, not in the recipe, in the equipment. His home blender overheated midway through processing the third batch, and the motor seized, and he stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning looking at a blender that would not turn on, and 60 pounds of peppers he had slow roasted the night before, and no way to finish what he had started. He called June at 4:15. She answered on the second ring. She said, "What happened?" He explained. She said, "Come over, I have a food processor." He spent 2 hours in June's kitchen finishing the batch with her food processor and her kitchen oven. She sat at her table drinking coffee and watching and not saying much, which was the right thing to do when a person is working through a problem that requires hands, not conversation. Afterward she said, "You need commercial equipment. That blender was not built for this volume." He said he knew. She said, "What are you waiting for?" He said, "The money isn't there yet." She said, "How much?" He had looked at commercial blenders the week before. A refurbished unit that could handle his current volume without risk ran about $600. He said, "$600?" She went to a drawer in her kitchen and took out a checkbook. He shook his head before she had opened it. She said, "It is a loan. I want to see the receipts when you pay me back. That is all I want." He paid her back in 9 weeks. The equipment problem was solved, but it had surfaced a larger question. He was making 60 jars a week and selling all of them. He could increase to 80 and probably sell those. The ceiling of what his home kitchen and his own 2 hands could produce was real and closer than he had expected when this started. He was also approaching the edge of the cottage food revenue cap. Not yet, but approaching. If he stayed on the current trajectory, he would cross $50,000 within 12 months of starting. And crossing that line meant entering a different category with a different set of requirements he had not yet met. He went to the library. He spent an afternoon on the state website and a business licensing resource page he found through a search. He learned the difference between a cottage food producer and a licensed food manufacturer. A licensed food manufacturer required a certified commercial kitchen, an inspection by the Georgia Department of Agriculture, a food processing permit, liability insurance, and proper labeling, including a nutrition facts panel, which his current handwritten labels did not have. He wrote each item down. He added estimated costs beside each one. The commercial kitchen rental was between $18 and $30 per hour, depending on the facility. The food processing permit was $100. The liability insurance was $450 per year. The nutrition panel required lab testing or a USDA-approved software analysis, which ran between $50 and $200 depending on the method. The list was not short, but it was finite. It was a list of things that existed with known costs, and that was different from the formless dread of not knowing what stood between where he was and where he needed to get. He called a food business incubator he had found referenced on the state website. A woman named Phyllis, who ran the program, called him back the next day. She told him about a shared commercial kitchen in East Atlanta that rented to small food producers. It was licensed and inspected. The rate was $20 per hour with a minimum of 4 hours per session. She said they had 2 openings on Wednesday evenings. He drove to the kitchen the following Thursday to see it. It was in a converted warehouse space with high ceilings and industrial ventilation, and 6 stainless steel workstations with commercial blenders and standing mixers and ovens that did not require mental correction when you set the temperature. He touched the edge of one of the stainless steel counters. It was cold and precise and indifferent in the way of professional surfaces that have no memory because they are cleaned to have no memory. He booked the first Wednesday slot. The first night in the commercial kitchen, he produced 200 jars. He stood at the end of the session looking at the filled jars cooling on the racks and did the math in his head. 200 jars at $9. He had used 4 hours of kitchen time. His ingredient cost, his jar and lid cost, his jar and lid cost, his kitchen rental. He wrote the numbers in the spiral notebook in the car before he drove home. He could scale. Not infinitely. Not yet. But the commercial kitchen had removed the ceiling his home kitchen had put on him. By September, 6 months after the first market, he was producing 350 jars a week across 2 kitchen sessions. He was at 2 farmers markets, the one in DeKalb on Saturday and a smaller one in Avondale Estates on Sunday. He had a printed banner. He had a folding table with a tablecloth. He had a QR code on the table that linked to a contact form where people could place orders, which he was now legally permitted to fulfill because the commercial food license had removed the direct sale only restriction. The revenue in September was $11,400. He stared at the number in the spiral notebook for a long time. He had not had a month like this since before the plant layoff. He had not had a month like this, if he was honest, in a long time before that. Nadia helped on packing nights. She had developed a method for sealing the labels without air bubbles that was more consistent than his own, and she applied it with the focus she brought to most things, quietly and completely. One evening while they were working, she said, "Dad, are you going to do this forever?" He stopped peeling a label backing. He held it over the jar. He said, "Do you want me to?" She said, "I want you to do whatever makes you not look tired." He set the label down. He looked at his daughter, who was 11 years old and had inherited his mother's ability to say the exact thing that needed saying without ornament or preamble. He said, "I am tired. But it is a different kind of tired than before." She said, "What is the difference?" He said, "Before, I was tired and I did not know why I was waking up. Now I wake up for this." She considered this. Then she picked up another jar and applied the label and pressed it flat with her palm. The same gesture he made without thinking, the one he had picked up somewhere in the years of handling jars and bills and small, significant things. The message came on a Friday morning in October, not a phone call. An email. The subject line was, "Inquiry, Mama B's Hot Sauce, Target Category Review." He read it twice in the parking lot of the commercial kitchen where he had just finished a Wednesday session and had stayed to clean and had forgotten his phone inside and had gone back for it and was standing in the parking lot at 6:45 in the morning reading an email from a man named David Chen, who identified himself as a specialty foods buyer for Target Corporation based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The email said that David had encountered Mama B's at the DeKalb Farmers Market the previous Saturday through a colleague who had purchased a jar and brought it to a category team meeting. The team had sampled it. They wanted to set up a call. Franklin sat in the car in the parking lot of the commercial kitchen. The sky was beginning to lighten over the roofline of the warehouse. He had 40 jars of Mama B's in the trunk, which he was going to drop at the Sunday market on his way home. He had a spiral notebook in the glove compartment with 9 months of weekly revenue figures in it. He had a commercial kitchen booking on Wednesday and a market slot on Saturday and Sunday, and a contact form with 11 pending pre-orders. He sat in the car for a while. Then he called June. She answered on the second ring. She always did. He said, "A buyer from Target emailed me." There was a silence. Not a long one. She said, "Well, you had better call him back." What followed was the most compressed period of Franklin's working life. The call with David lasted 40 minutes. David explained Target's process for bringing in new food vendors. There was a category review meeting in Minneapolis in 8 weeks. Franklin would need to present the product in person. He would need retail-ready packaging with a UPC barcode, a full nutrition facts panel, proof of liability insurance, evidence of production capacity, shelf life documentation, and suggested retail pricing with unit cost at scale. Each requirement landed with individual weight. His current labels were printed at the library on adhesive paper. They did not have a nutrition panel. They did not have a barcode. They were not retail ready in any sense that a Target shelf buyer would recognize. He wrote each item on the back of a paper bag in his car after the call. He circled each one. Then he drove home and sat at the kitchen table and made a second list with estimated costs and estimated timelines. He found a food label designer through a freelance platform online, a man in Portland who had done packaging for several specialty food brands and who charged $200 for a full design with print-ready files. Franklin sent him 3 jars of the sauce in the mail, a photograph of his mother standing in her garden in August, and a single line. "This recipe is 40 years old. Make it look like it." The designer delivered a proof in 5 days. The label was deep brick red with a clean serif font. The product name ran across the top in letters that were confident without being loud. Below the logo, in smaller print, a Macon family recipe, made with peppers from the garden. Franklin approved it without changes. The UPC barcode registration through GS1 cost $250. He paid it on a Tuesday morning and received a number that meant his product existed in the tracking system that retail stores use to manage inventory. A number, but a number that was the difference between something a person sold at a folding table and something a laser could read on a shelf. The nutrition facts panel required a lab analysis. He found a USDA-approved food testing lab in Atlanta that offered an expedited analysis for $180. He dropped off samples on a Wednesday. The results came back in 6 days. He sent the file to the designer. The designer updated the label file. The co-manufacturer was the hardest part. To meet the volume requirements for even a regional target placement, he needed a facility that could produce thousands of units per week to FDA standards. His commercial kitchen sessions, which had been his breakthrough, were now the ceiling. He found the facility through a contact Phyllis at the incubator had given him months earlier, a note she had written on a post-it that he had kept in the spiral notebook without being sure why. A woman named Carol who ran a small co-packing operation in Norcross, 30 minutes from Decatur, 2 production lines, a staff of 8. She had worked with small sauce brands before. Franklin drove to Norcross with 2 jars of Mama Bia's and the recipe written out in full in his own handwriting. He had never written it down before. The measurements lived in his hands, taught by his mother's hands, in that kitchen in Macon. Writing them on paper felt like translating something from a language that was not meant to have a written form. He sat in the parking lot before going inside. He thought about his mother, who had made this sauce every August for 40 years and given it away at church and at cookouts and across the back fence, and never once thought about what it was worth in dollars because she had not been making it for dollars. She had been making it because people were hungry and she had something that fed them. He went inside. He stood beside Carol's production manager, a careful man named Al, and walked him through every step. The roasting temperature for the garlic, the way the peppers needed to be handled after drying, the timing on the blend, the exact moment the acidity needed to be checked before sealing. Carol's team ran a test batch of 500 units. Franklin broke open a jar in the parking lot before driving home. He dipped a piece of bread he had brought from the car. The heat came in the right order. The garlic was underneath it, the way it was supposed to be. It was not identical to what his hands made in the commercial kitchen in East Atlanta. It was close enough to carry the name. He drove to Minneapolis on a Sunday. Nadia stayed with Sandra. The drive was 14 hours, and he made it straight through with the radio off and his mind going over the numbers the way his mind went over things. Not anxiously, but methodically, the way he had once done diagnostics on the machines at the plant, checking each component in sequence. He arrived at the hotel at 11 at night. He put the box of sample jars on the desk and the folder with documents beside it. And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them. Retail-ready packaging, UPC barcode, nutrition panel, liability certificate, food processing permit, co-manufacturer agreement, production capacity projections that Carol had helped him draft on a spreadsheet, suggested retail at $7.99 for an 8-ounce jar, unit cost at 5,000 units per week, $1.74, $74.54. He had everything they had asked for. He did not have certainty that he belonged in the room. He knew that was a different thing and that there was no document that covered it. The target building was the kind of large that is not fully communicated by photographs. He carried a box of samples in both arms and wore the sport coat he had bought at a consignment shop in Decatur for $35 because it was the right kind of thing to wear, and because he did not own one and had not owned one for years. He walked to the room number in David's email. David was already seated. He was younger than Franklin expected. He had a notepad and a pen and a bottle of water and the efficient posture of someone who had done this 30 times that week and had 20 more before the review cycle ended. He said, "Tell me about the product." Franklin did not have slides. He had the box and the folder and the story. He told him about his mother, about the garden in Macon and the August batches and the way she measured spices with her hands because her hands were the measurement, about the Saturday morning standing beside the stove when he was 9 years old, being told to pay attention to the smell because the smell was the timer, about the morning he lost his job and stood in the kitchen and looked at the jar and started doing math on the back of an envelope, about June and the borrowed table, and the first Saturday when he sold 2 jars in 2 hours, and the second Saturday when it was different, and the third Saturday when it was different again. Then he opened the box and said, "This is what the recipe became." David picked up a jar. He opened it and put a small amount on the back of his hand, the way people in the food industry sample sauces and tasted it. He did not say anything for a moment. He wrote something on the notepad. He asked about shelf life. Franklin said 12 months in sealed packaging, 8 after opening, refrigerated. He asked about unit cost at 10,000 units per week. Franklin gave him the number Carol had projected. He asked about the suggested retail and the margin structure at that price. Franklin gave him the numbers. He asked what made it different from the 12 other artisan hot sauces on his review list. Franklin said, most hot sauce is built around the heat. This one is built around what is underneath the heat. The garlic is roasted until it caramelizes. The peppers are dried long enough that the heat mellows into something more complex. My mother spent 40 years adjusting those two variables and she got them right. No one else has those 40 years. David wrote something else on the notepad. He did not smile. He did not nod. He looked at his notes for a moment. Then he said, "We're going to start with 80 stores in the Southeast. If it moves, we expand to the region." Franklin said, "Thank you." He stood. He picked up the box. He walked down the long hallway past other vendors who were still waiting with their products and their folders and their practiced introductions, and he went outside and stood in the parking lot of Target's headquarters in Minneapolis in a sport coat that cost $35, and he took out his phone and called June. She answered on the second ring. He said, 80 stores. The silence lasted just long enough. She said, "I want my name on a jar." He laughed for the first time in what felt like a long time. He said, "Done." He drove home the following day. Nadia was back from Sandra's when he pulled into the driveway. She came outside when she heard the car and stood on the front step in her school clothes. He got out and said, "They are going to put it in 80 stores." She said, "Is that a lot?" He said, "It is more than the market table." She thought about this with the particular seriousness she brought to numbers. Then she said, "Is it enough?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Enough for what?" She said, "Enough for you to stop looking like you are waiting for something to go wrong." He stood in the driveway in the late afternoon light. He did not have an answer for that immediately. Then he said, "I do not know yet, but I think I am starting to look at what is going right instead." She accepted this the way she accepted most things, with the quiet completeness of a child who has learned that her father's answers are usually honest even when they are incomplete. They went inside. He went to the cabinet above the counter and took down a jar. He opened it and put a small amount on a piece of bread, the same way he had done in Carol's parking lot in Norcross, the same way he had been doing since he was 9 years old, standing beside his mother in a kitchen in Macon. And he tasted it. The garlic was where it was supposed to be. The heat came in the right order. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, Franklin drove to the Target on Candler Road in Decatur. He parked and went inside. Nadia was with him. June was with him. June had driven herself, which she noted was the second time she'd driven somewhere specific in months, and that this occasion merited it. They walked past the registers and the produce section and the end caps with seasonal items and turned into the condiment aisle. Shelf 3. Between a national brand that had been there since Franklin was a child and a store brand bottle he had never noticed was a jar. The label was brick red. The letters were clean and confident. The name read, Mama Bia's. Beatrice Okafor had never been in a Target. She had never filled out a vendor application or spoken with a category buyer or driven 14 hours to present a product in a conference room. She had grown peppers in her garden every summer for 40 years and made a sauce in a pot in her kitchen in Macon and given it away at church and to neighbors and to anyone who sat at her table, because that was what you did when you had something good and someone was nearby who had not had it yet. She was on this shelf now, not her photograph, not a statue in her likeness. A recipe, a set of instructions that lived in a notebook Franklin had finally written out in full, that had begun in her hands and moved to his, and that had traveled from a kitchen in Macon to a pot in Decatur, to a facility in Norcross, to a conference room in Minneapolis to here. Franklin stood in the aisle for a moment. June put her hand briefly on his arm, the way people do when what they feel is larger than words. And a hand is what is available. Nadia reached up and touched the jar. She said, "That is Grandma Bay's name." Franklin said, "Yes, it is." She did not say anything else. She took the jar off the shelf and put it in the basket she was carrying, the way you carry something that already belongs to you. Franklin Okafor had started with $43 in his account, a jar his mother had made, and a folding table borrowed from a neighbor. He woke up at 4 in the morning on market days. He sat on the floor of a commercial kitchen once after a failed batch and did not get up until he had finished the math. He wrote a recipe down for the first time in his life in a parking lot in Norcross because the moment required it. Some people start a business with capital and a plan and a team of people whose job is to make the idea possible. Some start with a jar on a counter and a question they cannot answer yet, and a neighbor who lends them a table and a daughter who counts labels with the precision of someone who understands without being told that what is being built matters. Both kinds are real. Both kinds cost something. The difference is only where you begin. I keep thinking about the moment Franklin stood in his kitchen the afternoon he lost his job. He did not make a plan. He did not call anyone. He picked up a jar his mother had made and turned it in his hands and set it back down. That was all. And somehow that was the beginning of everything. There is a version of this story where nothing happens, where he sets the jar down and makes coffee, and sends out resumes and eventually finds another plant job, and the sauce stays on the counter, and that is where it ends. That version is not unusual. That version happens all the time, to people who are just as capable, just as tired, carrying things just as valuable. The difference, as far as I can tell, is not talent, and it is not luck in the way people usually mean luck. It is something closer to honesty. Franklin looked at what he actually had, not what he wished he had, not what he used to have, and he started there. That is harder than it sounds. Most of us spend a long time waiting to start from somewhere better. What strikes me about the way he built this is that he never outran his own understanding. When the cottage food law told him there was a ceiling, he went to the library and read until he knew what the ceiling was made of. When the blender seized at 4 in the morning, he did not treat it as a sign to stop. He called a neighbor and finished the batch. When 350 jars in a commercial kitchen came out wrong, he sat on the floor long enough to do the math, and then he stood up and figured out what the oven needed. That is a kind of intelligence that does not show up on a resume. It is the intelligence of a person who refuses to let a problem be larger than their attention to it. And there is something in the way he handled the recipe that I have not stopped thinking about. He had never written it down. It lived in his hands the way his mother had put it there, Saturday morning by Saturday morning, in a kitchen in Macon, when he finally had to write it out, sitting in a parking lot in Norcross before handing it to strangers to produce at scale. He did it. He did not guard the recipe out of sentiment. He understood that the point of the recipe was never to be kept. The point was to feed people. His mother had known that for 40 years. He honored that by letting it reach further than her hands alone could have carried it. I think about Nadia counting labels at the kitchen table, pressing them flat with her palm the same way her father pressed bills flat without thinking about it. She had learned the gesture without being taught it. That is what integrity looks like when it travels through a family. It does not announce itself. It just shows up in the hands. The thing Franklin built was not built because he was fearless. He was tired. He questioned whether the math would ever work. He sat on commercial kitchen floors. He drove 14 hours with the radio off, going over numbers, not because he was certain, but because uncertainty was not a reason to stop. That is what I would call real persistence. Not the kind that never doubts, but the kind that doubts and keeps going anyway. Because stopping would mean giving up on something that matters more than the discomfort of not knowing how it ends. When Nadia touched that jar on the Target shelf and said, "That is Grandma Bea's name," she was not wrong. It was. And it was Franklin's name too. And it was Nadia's name, in the way that anything built with that much honesty and patience belongs to everyone who held it. If you had $43 and a recipe from someone you lost, what would you do with it? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.